If you think you heard your name being called out from the dark, no, you didn't. That's the rule for survival we always hear about the deep woods. But what happens when the voice isn't coming from the trees? What happens when it's inside your own home, coming from the mouth of your 3-year-old child? We often dismiss the terrors of a child as an overactive imagination, telling them there is nothing in the closet, and that the whispers they hear in the dead of night are just the house settling. But sometimes, the things they see possess a terrifying, undeniable reality. Today, we are exploring the raw, unfiltered phenomenon of real, documented cases of psychic children. Anecdotal accounts and historical records of children who knew things they shouldn't, saw things that weren't there, and predicted horrors yet to come. First, we will step directly into the chilling, real-world accounts of these gifted and burdened children. Before transitioning into a dark documentary deep dive to analyze the science, the psychology, and the unexplainable voids where modern logic completely breaks down, hit that subscribe button, turn off the lights, and let's look through the eyes of the children who see into the dark. In parapsychological literature, some of the most chilling accounts come not from grand, theatrical displays of telekinesis, but from the quiet. This is the real account of a boy named Ethan, whose family moved into a classic 2-story colonial home in New England. To the parents, the house was a dream, affordable, spacious, surrounded by quiet woods. To 3-year-old Ethan, however, the house was crowded. From the very first night in his new bedroom, Ethan's behavior underwent a drastic, terrifying transformation. A child who had previously slept through the night would wake up at precisely 3:14 a.m. every single morning, screaming in a state of absolute, inconsolable panic. When his mother would rush into the room, she would find him pressed flat against the headboard of his bed, his tiny hands pointed toward the empty center of the room. He would sob that a smoky man was standing there, hot and hurting. The parents assumed it was a standard case of night terrors, a common pediatric occurrence. They bought a nightlight, left the door cracked, and tried to soothe him. But the details Ethan provided began to grow impossibly specific. One afternoon, while sitting in the kitchen drawing with crayons, Ethan looked up at his mother and asked why the lady jumped out of the window because the fire was biting her feet. His mother froze. The house had no history of fire listed on its modern real estate disclosure. Weeks later, the atmospheric shifts in Ethan's bedroom became undeniable. The temperature in the center of the room would drop by 10 to 15 degrees in an instant, a localized freezing pocket that left the parents' breath visible in the air. Yet, Ethan would be dripping with sweat, pulling at his collar, complaining that his throat filled full of black ash. Desperate for answers, the family began a deep historical archive search of the local municipality. What they discovered sent a wave of icy dread through their lives. 60 years prior, long before the modern residential development was constructed, a small farmhouse had stood on the exact same coordinates of land. In the winter of 1954, a catastrophic electrical fire had consumed the structure in the middle of the night. A mother and her young son had been trapped in the upper bedroom. The mother, in a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating smoke, had leapt from the window. Her son had perished in the center of the room, succumbing to smoke inhalation. Ethan had never been exposed to this history. He was 3 years old. He did not know what smoke inhalation meant, yet he described the black ash filling his throat. The entity Ethan was interacting with wasn't just an external ghost. It was actively bleeding its final, agonizing sensory experiences directly into the mind of a child whose brain was still forming. While some children see the remnants of a tragic past frozen in the spaces they inhabit, others are forced to look forward, their minds pulled into the terrifying, unwritten chapters of the future. Premonitive psychic abilities in children are often characterized by a profound, heavy sense of doom that the child cannot logically articulate, transforming environmental signals into physical torment. In the early 2000s, a 10-year-old girl named Morgan living on a rural farm property, began experiencing what her family initially diagnosed as severe somatic anxiety. Morgan was a quiet, highly empathetic child, but without warning, she would suffer from sudden, paralyzing physical illnesses. She would clutch her stomach, vomit, and weep, claiming that the ground beneath her feet was screaming. The first major incident occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. Morgan was sitting in her 5th grade classroom when she suddenly stood up, let out a piercing shriek, and collapsed to the floor, clawing at her ears. When the school nurse revived her, Morgan was hyperventilating, repeating a single phrase over and over. "The water is eating the houses. The water is eating the houses." Less than 48 hours later, an unprecedented flash flood, triggered by a sudden catastrophic dam failure, occurred 3 counties over, sweeping away an entire residential valley and claiming dozens of lives. Morgan's premonitions were not vague, astrological guesses. They were visceral, sensory overloads. In the months that followed, Morgan's mother began keeping a detailed journal of her daughter's episodes. The journal reads like a ledger of localized tragedies. Morgan would wake up crying that her bones felt crushed. The next day, a major structural collapse would occur at a nearby industrial site. She would scream that her face was burning. Hours later, a multi-car pileup involving a tanker truck would make local headlines. The psychological toll on a child possessing this level of precognition is devastating. Morgan wasn't just predicting the news. She was experiencing the localized trauma of strangers before it ever happened. The universe was using the raw, unfiltered neural network of a child as a radio antenna for tragedy, picking up the high-frequency screams of the future while leaving her powerless to change the outcome. This concept of the young mind acting as a biological bridge across time takes an even more baffling turn when a child's memories don't just predict a future tragedy, but perfectly reconstruct a past life. They never lived. Perhaps the most thoroughly vetted, terrifying, and historically baffling case of child mediumship and past life memory involves a young boy named James Leininger. Born in the late 1990s, toddler, cells. When James was just 2 years old, he began playing with toy airplanes in a highly unusual, violent manner. He wouldn't just fly them through the air, he would violently crash them into the coffee table, shouting about an airplane crash on fire where the little man couldn't get out. Soon, the nightmares began. James would thrash in his bed, kicking his legs in the air, screaming at the ceiling the exact same words. When his mother, Andrea, managed to wake him from these terrors, the toddler would be staring blindly ahead, completely disoriented. As James's speech developed, the details he provided transitioned from creepy to impossible. He told his parents that he used to fly a plane called a Corsair. He described how the plane would pull to the left on takeoff, a highly specific mechanical quirk unique to the FRU Corsair aircraft that only WW2 aviation historians would know. When his father, Bruce Leininger, a staunch skeptic who initially set out to disprove his son's claims, asked James who the little man in his nightmares was, the 2-year-old responded without hesitation. "Me." James claimed his name had been James too. He stated that he had flown his plane off a massive boat called the Natoma. He even named his best friend on the ship, a man named Jack Larson. Bruce Leininger launched an obsessive years-long historical investigation. He tracked down military records that had been classified or buried in naval archives for decades. What he found defied every law of physical reality. There was, in fact, a small escort carrier called the USS Natoma Bay that operated in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Bruce scanned the ship, his historical roster. Stationed on the USS Natoma Bay was a pilot named Jack Larson, who was still alive and living in Arkansas. And more terrifyingly, Bruce discovered that only one single pilot from the USS Natoma Bay had been shot down and killed during the Battle of Iwo Jima. A young man from Pennsylvania whose aircraft had been hit squarely in the engine by Japanese anti-aircraft fire, bursting into flames and plunging directly into the ocean. His name was James Houston Jr. When young James Leininger was shown a photograph of the USS Natoma Bay's crew, a photo he had never seen before in his life. His toddler finger moved across the sepia-toned faces of dead men, stopping directly on a man standing near the back, whispering that it was his friend Bob. Bruce checked the archive roster. The man James pointed to was pilot Bob Greenwald. How does a 2-year-old child who has never watched a military documentary, never read a book on aviation, and barely knows how to tie his shoes, map out the precise mechanical physics of a WWY fighter plane, identify obscure historical figures by name, and accurately recall the exact coordinates of a violent death that occurred 50 years before his birth? When we look at these accounts, the smoky men in the bedrooms, the premonitions of disaster, the highly specific historical memories of dead soldiers, we are faced with a profound psychological and existential fork in the road. Are we witnessing genuine supernatural anomalies? Or is there a complex hidden mechanism within the human mind that can explain these terrors without rewriting the laws of physics? To understand why these phenomena are overwhelmingly reported in young children rather than adults, we must first look at the unique architecture of the developing brain. Between the ages of 2 and 7, a human child operates primarily within a state of neurological development dominated by delta and theta brainwave frequencies. In adults, delta and theta waves are typically reserved for deep sleep, REM dreaming, and high-level meditation. Adults operate primarily in alpha and beta states, frequencies dedicated to logic, critical thinking, stress, and external sensory processing. A young child, therefore, is essentially living in a waking dream state. In this theta state, the boundary between the internal subconscious mind and external reality is highly fluid. Children do not possess the rigid cognitive filters that adults use to dismiss anomalous data. If an adult sees a strange fleeting shadow in the corner of their eye, their beta-driven brain instantly rationalizes it as a trick of the light or a passing car headlight. A child's brain lacks this automatic censorship. They accept the sensory input exactly as it appears. Furthermore, the pineal gland, often referred to in esoteric circles as the third eye, but known scientifically to regulate melatonin and circadian rhythms, is physically larger in proportion to a child's brain mass than an adult's. As humans hit puberty, the pineal gland undergoes a process of calcification, shrinking and reducing its chemical output. Some alternative neurological theories suggest that the uncalcified, highly sensitive pineal gland of a child may act as a raw biological sensor, picking up electromagnetic variances, ambient environmental changes, or subtle low-frequency vibrations that adult brains are completely blind to. From a strictly skeptical, psychological perspective, many of these cases can also be examined through a fascinating cognitive phenomenon known as cryptomnesia. Cryptomnesia occurs when a person retains a piece of information, a memory, or a fact, but their brain forgets the source of that information. The individual genuinely believes the thought is entirely original, or in the case of a child, a supernatural revelation or past life memory. Consider how a toddler absorbs information. Children are digital and linguistic sponges. They sit in rooms while parents watch documentaries in the background. They overhear adult conversations. They glance at open books, magazines, or tablet screens. A 3-year-old child might see a 5-second clip of a World War II documentary on television while playing with blocks on the floor. To the parent, the child isn't paying attention. But the child's subconscious mind captures the image of the plane, the name of the ship, or the uniform of the soldier, storing it deep within the neural vaults. Years later, when that information resurfaces during a dream or a play session, the child cannot identify the source. They don't recall seeing it on television. Instead, their highly imaginative theta brain wraps a narrative around the memory, convincing them that it was a real experience. This is frequently amplified by a psychological feedback loop called confirmation bias and inadvertent cold reading by the parents. When a child says something slightly creepy, a parent's natural reaction is shock, fear, or intense curiosity. The parent begins asking leading questions, prompting the child for details about the entity or the memory. The child, eager to please and highly sensitive to adult emotional cues, reads the parent's facial expressions and body language. They accept the details provided by the parent, weave them into the narrative, and over time, the memory solidifies into a seemingly authentic paranormal account. But even when we apply the strict mechanics of cryptomnesia, brainwave analysis, and parental reinforcement, we run headfirst into a wall of cases that defy these rational explanations entirely. In the case of James Leininger, to explain his knowledge via cryptomnesia, one would have to prove that a 2-year-old child somehow gained access to highly classified, undigitized naval military records from 1945, records that required his father to travel to national archives and write formal requests to uncover. The child could not have casually seen a documentary detailing the specific mechanical flaw of a Corsair pulling to the left on takeoff, because that detail was sourced from interviews with surviving veteran pilots, not mainstream media. Furthermore, how do we explain cases of xenoglossy, instances where young children, with no exposure to foreign languages, suddenly begin speaking, writing, or praying in ancient, dead, or highly complex regional dialects? In the annals of parapsychology, there are multiple documented accounts of children in isolated, monolingual environments who, upon reaching a certain age, begin speaking fluent, archaic forms of languages like Sanskrit, ancient Aramaic, or specific regional dialects of Mandarin that are no longer spoken in modern times. Cryptomnesia cannot account for the production of a language the child has never physically heard. This brings us to the most unsettling scientific frontier, the quantum theory of consciousness. Physicists and neuroscientists have long debated the exact nature of human consciousness, questioning whether the mind is merely a byproduct of biological gray matter or a receiver for a consciousness that exists independently of physical tissue. According to the theory of orchestrated objective reduction, consciousness originates from quantum vibrations within the brain's microbules, microscopic structures inside our neurons. If consciousness exists at a quantum level, it is not bound by the standard constraints of linear time or spatial distance. If the human brain is a biological radio receiver, an adult brain is locked onto a specific high-power local station, the physical reality of the present moment. But a child's brain, with its uncalcified systems and hyper-flexible neural plasticity, may have its dial turned slightly askew. They are picking up the static, the bleeding signals, and the phantom broadcasts of other stations across the quantum field, picking up the residue of lives lived before, or the high-frequency vibrations of events that have yet to unfold in our linear timeline. The phenomenon of psychic children leaves us in a deeply uncomfortable position. If we choose to believe the strict materialist view, we must accept that the human mind possesses an almost terrifying capacity for accidental deception. That a child's brain can fabricate flawless historical narratives, predict localized tragedies, and mimic sensory trauma out of thin air, all before they can read a full book. But if we accept the alternative, the truth is far more haunting. It means that the world we see, touch, and measure is only a fraction of reality. It means that when your child wakes up crying in the middle of the night, pointing to the dark corner of the room, claiming that someone is standing there. They might not be having a nightmare. They might just be the only person in the room who can see the truth. What about you? Did you have an imaginary friend who knew things they shouldn't have? Or did your own children ever speak of memories from a life that wasn't theirs? Drop your experiences in the comments below. I want to read your real stories. If this journey into the sixth sense of innocence gave you chills, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves the deep mysteries of the mind. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the dark. Stay safe, keep the lights on, and the next time a child tells you they see something in the shadows, believe them.